want you to tell my audience about the daily life in UK, because you live there, right? So we hear the news, right? That inflation and this, that, but you're on the ground. So can you tell us your own experience, your observations about the daily life in UK today? How
Yes.
are things going?
Well, I think the general feeling in Britain is that they're not going well. Now, to be clear, Britain is a rich country. It's always been a rich country, and it continues to be. But it's a rich country where divisions are increasing. There are obviously some people, especially in London, who remain enormously wealthy. But the middle class is seeing its living standards erode, and people lower down the social economic scale are seeing their living standards erode even more. Where also, inflation can take many forms. One is that the price of goods gets higher. The second is that they disappear. And if you now visit British food shops, for example, you're starting to see lots of empty shelves, something I never have seen for a very long time. You have to go back to the 1970s to experience this. And people in Britain are, they feel under a lot of economic pressure. There's very high levels of personal debt here. Interest rates are higher. Food prices are higher. Prices of most things are becoming more expensive. And on top of that, lots of things which used to be available free are now becoming things that you have to pay for. So, use of public facilities, for example, which you could use freely, now you suddenly find increasingly that you have to pay to use them, and they're becoming fewer of them. So there is a sense of economic decline. But I think what is particularly bad is not just, that we're going through difficult economic times. I mean, countries go through difficult economic times, and that can be demoralizing, but usually there's some hope that things will get better. The problem in Britain today is that people look at the various political parties, our political leadership, and they feel that it has no real answers to the country's problems, that there's no real difference between Conservative and Labour, that the parties, the political leaders, have lost interest in the lives of their people. There is a widespread feeling that corruption at the centre of power has now grown, and grown very fast. And Britain is a country which traditionally did not have a problem of corruption, but now there is a sense that it does. And so there's a sense that the political leadership is become remote, self-seeking, out of touch, and increasingly intolerant as it feels increasingly insecure. So you have that is, I would say, the overall sense in Britain today. Political, economic decay amidst conditions of political stagnation.
Yeah, you actually answered my second question, because I had a follow-up questions about that, what the UK government is doing, to address these concerns. But it seems like right now, there isn't much, right? Both parties seems like doesn't have solutions. So
they don't have solutions. They don't have any real plans. The government doesn't want to cut taxes. It doesn't want to raise taxes. It doesn't want to carry out a spending program. Maybe it shouldn't. It basically, the feeling is that we don't have government. What we have is administration. That the government manages but doesn't actually govern. It isn't coming up with proposals. It isn't coming up with plans. And, in Britain, we have the system of alternating parties. Our political system is based on this, that there's Her Majesty's government and Her Majesty's loyal opposition. And the idea is you have this and it is very ritualized. It always has been, by the way, a very ritualized system of debate. It's never quite as meaningful as people on the outside assume. But anyway, it has existed, and it has meant that sometimes there've been ideas circulating within the system. You don't have that sense anymore. The entire elite all seem to be agreed that the thing to do is to do as little as possible and to keep things as they are, even as they're getting worse. And that, I think, is very demoralizing in Britain altogether.
Well, it's more or less the same here in the United States. I mean, they fight a lot. The two parties fight a lot, but they are not fighting on important issues, like, you know, build up more roads and the healthcare crisis and the homeless problem, you know, the gun violence. I mean, we get used to the gun violence. It's like a daily occurrences now, mass shooting, right? And I don't know if you know the number, like last year, 2022, the people died of gun violence was like over 40,000 people. I mean, Russia was in a war. They got killed like 20,000 or something. So who is really in the war? I mean, it just, those numbers, you know, astonishing, but nobody's talking about it, you know, so.
Well, it is exactly the same here. I mean, you know, Britain used to have a fairly impressive infrastructure system. I mean, you know, in the 19th century, it built up an enormous railway system,
for example,
which has hardly been modernized or invested in for decades. So it's very decayed. The British road system doesn't even compare well with what you find elsewhere in Europe, and it's slowly deteriorating. The health system is in crisis, and you know, the British after the Second World War created a public health system, which is
which is very good system.
Well, in theory, but as I said, it's been starved of investment. It's in crisis. The education system also in crisis, and obviously we don't have a gun problem in Britain because the history and practice in Britain and the law is that you can't just own guns in the way that you can in the United States. But there's, again, a feeling that crime generally is getting much, much worse. And of course, if you live in a city like I do, I mean, you can't walk anywhere in London without coming across drugs abuse on a scale that is now an epidemic scale. And I mean, and that isn't an attractive thing either, for obvious reasons.
I want to ask you something about the Brexit. This is really my own curiosity about the Conservative Party, which I'm sure you're pretty familiar with. So seems to me like this relationship between United Kingdom and the Europe, you know, continental Europe, has always been some of the unsolved issue with the Conservative Party. Like Margaret Thatcher, I think her oust has something to do with it. I don't know. I mean, you can correct me. Now, John Major after her, I don't think that's the issue. He was ousted by, I mean, he was later replaced by Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, which are Labour Party, right? And then came David Cameron. David Cameron is the one who initiated the referendum of Brexit. My feeling is that he really wanted to settle this once for all, like having a referendum, and okay, that's it, whether we wish Europe or not, right? So referendum seems like a good way to go. But I guess he didn't expect it actually get passed, that the Brexit actually did get passed. I think he was on the with Europe side, and then he was hoping the referendum would, you know, strengthen his position, but it didn't. Instead, it became a Brexit. After him, Theresa May was trying to negotiate some kind of deal with Europe. Didn't go very well, so she's out until Boris Johnson came in. Is this question really settled within? I just want to know the Conservative Party. Is that true that there is very strong factions within the two regarding the relationship between UK and EU? And is that problem being solved now? Is it?
Yeah, I think that, well, it hasn't been solved. It is completely unresolved, and the problems are as deep set as always. And I think you're actually very correct in identifying the Conservative Party as the centre of this, because the thing to understand about the Conservative Party is that it's not a party with a particularly clearly defined ideology, certainly not anymore. But what it does have are very powerful factions within it, which are constantly maneuvering for some types of control. Now, the other thing to understand about the Conservative Party is that it is the inheritor of the British imperialist tradition. And this is important to understanding this issue because, of course, Britain in the 19th century and much of the 20th century, most of the 20th century, was the world's foremost imperialist power. It was also a global power. It meant that the British had interests in many places, in Africa, in Latin America. They ruled India, as we all know. They had many places. They also colonized, in other words, they expelled the inhabitants, put their own people there, in Canada, in Australia, in South Africa, all sorts of things of this kind. So there is within the Conservative Party a tradition of looking outwards, of thinking of Britain in world terms, and also being very close to that great power, which to some extent has inherited Britain's mantle, and which is also English speaking, which is the United States. And at the same time, that means that Britain, which is of course also an island detached from the continent of Europe, as a result, has tended to see itself as different to and superior to the rest of Europe. So this is all very much within the British tradition and the Conservative tradition. There's a sense that our law, our system of law is different from that in Europe. We have a monarchy, which they don't really anymore to any great extent in Europe. Our political structures are different. And we want to be different from Europe in some ways. Or if we can't be different from the Europeans, if we have to be part of Europe, we feel that we should lead it. We should be the dominant power in Europe because, well, let's face it, we've always been the dominant power. We're not the dominant power in Europe. Germany is economically stronger. The French are also there and they don't dare be like us, all those sort of things. So we've had that push-pull. We've had some people within the British establishment and the British elite who are attracted to Britain going into Europe, who want to see Britain at the heart of Europe, who feel that Britain's position in the modern world should be within Europe. And then there's other people who say, well, no, this isn't really where we belong. We should leave Europe behind us. We should revert to being or trying to be a world power, a global power. We should be closer to the United States, the great English-speaking country. So let's turn our backs on Europe. They're different to us. They're inferior to us in all kinds of ways because, you know, we're superior people. So yeah, let's go the other way. And that division exists within the Conservative Party. Now, within the Conservative Party, you have what you might call the business elite, the commercial people, the sort of establishment elite, and of course the civil service. They tend to be more pro-European because their economic financial interests are structured that way. And then you have the sentiment, if you like, in the grassroots of the party. Many of its members are quite elderly, so they still have memories of the great days of the empire, which, you know, are not that far back in the past. And they're resentful about the reduction of British power, and they feel that, you know, we shouldn't really be part of Europe because that's not where we were and that's not where we should be. And this plays out within the Conservative Party, and it tends to set the parliamentary leadership against the grassroots. So people like John Major, David Cameron, people like that, very much part of the establishment, they tend to the European side. People like Margaret Thatcher, Boris Johnson, more seeking the support of the grassroots, they tend to be on the anti-Europe side. And you get people like Theresa May, who aren't really sure where they want to be and try to please both sides and can't please either.
Yeah. I actually think it depends. It all depends on the execution in terms of whatever your ideology is. right? There are ways you can deal with Europe within European Union. But once you're out, there are also ways you can work things out, like increase your trade with United States, with Asian countries, with China. I think there, and also it doesn't stop you from working with Russia, for example. It is a country with a lot of cheap energy, etc. So I actually think that's where they should be doing, but instead they don't seem to do anything. So
you are absolutely correct. You're absolutely right. I mean, you can stay in Europe and play a strong game in Europe because Britain's a big country within European terms. It's still got a big economy, even if it's not very well run. You could play an important role in Europe if you fully committed yourself to do it. Or alternatively, you could leave Europe behind and play an active role as a proper member of the international community. And sometimes you get sort of people who do think like that. So the previous Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, for example, said he was pro-European, but he did want to play a more global role. And he saw the solution through establishing very close commercial and political links with China. Yeah. And he talked about a golden age in relations between Britain and China. But then that cuts against the populist wing of the party, which wants a more imperialistic, more great power type sort of policy, and who feel that Britain should be as close to the Americans as possible because they're the country that is most like us and which carries out our traditions. So America has problems with Russia. We have even greater problems with Russia because we need to be even more the policy that the Americans have than they do. And of course, if the Americans have problems with the Chinese, we must do so as well. Yeah. And we must be especially aggressive about them because we want to make up for our lack of power by increasing assertiveness and aggressiveness as a way of getting noticed. I think it is a disastrous policy from every conceivable point of view. Not only disastrous, I think it is absurd, but you will find many, many people, including Boris Johnson, by the way, who hanker for it.
Well, I think you explained really well because this is something I have been puzzled a lot, how the Conservative Party really thinking, seems like very much like a split party, but